There are places where silence feels natural. Forests after snowfall, empty churches at dawn, abandoned roads stretching into fog. And then, there are places where silence feels wrong. Oradour-sur-Glane is one of them. The town does not announce itself with warning signs or dramatic gates. There is no sense of crossing a boundary. One moment you are driving through the gentle countryside of central France. Rolling fields, quiet roads, birdsong drifting through open windows. And the next, you are there. A town without movement. A town without voices. A town that feels like it is holding its breath. The first thing people notice is not the ruins. It is the stillness. No hum of traffic, no distant conversation, no footsteps echoing where footsteps should echo. Only wind. Wind moving through broken windows. Wind brushing against rusted metal. Wind passing through doorways that no longer lead anywhere. Oradour-sur-Glane looks less like a destroyed town, and more like a town frozen mid-moment, as if something interrupted life so completely that time itself never recovered. A child's bicycle lies twisted near a collapsed wall, its tires long since rotted away. Shop signs still hang above empty storefronts, their letters faded but legible, as if waiting for customers who never came back. A sewing machine sits behind a shattered display window, its needle permanently paused halfway through work that was never finished. Nothing here looks abandoned in the usual sense. It looks interrupted. Visitors often lower their voices instinctively, even before they realize why. Some later say it feels disrespectful to speak too loudly. Others say the quiet presses against their ears, as though the town itself is listening. The ruins stretch across several streets, preserved exactly as they were left. Burned-out cars still sit where they stopped in 1944, their frames melted and warped by intense heat. Inside them, you can still see the outline of seats, steering wheels fused into unnatural shapes, metal frozen in agony. This was once a living town, not a military base, not a strategic position, not a battlefield, just a place where people lived. Oradour-sur-Glane was never meant to be remembered. Before the war, it was unremarkable in the best possible way. A modest market town where shopkeepers knew their customers by name, and children walked familiar paths to school. The Glane River flowed gently nearby, indifferent to politics, borders, and ideologies. Life here moved at a slower pace, untouched by the urgency of cities or the machinery of power. Even as the Second World War spread across Europe like a growing shadow, Oradour remained largely untouched, until it wasn't. But the strange thing is this: when people talk about Oradour today, they don't always start with what happened there. They start with how it feels. Tour guides will tell you the facts. They will explain dates, movements, official decisions. They will point out buildings, name victims, describe what is known and what remains uncertain. But when the tours end, when visitors walk alone through the empty streets, many report something harder to define: a sensation of being watched, not in a threatening way, not in a supernatural way, at least not obviously. More like the awareness that they are not alone, even when logic insists otherwise. Some say they hear footsteps behind them, slow and deliberate, only to turn and find no one there. Others describe the faint smell of smoke on days when the air is perfectly clear, when there are no fires for miles around. A few claim they have heard distant voices, too quiet to understand, too real to dismiss. Most shrug it off. The mind, after all, is powerful. History carries weight. Expectation shapes perception. And yet, the stories persist. Security guards assigned to watch over the ruins at night rarely speak publicly about their experiences. But privately, some have admitted they prefer not to patrol alone. Cameras have occasionally recorded unexplained sounds, scraping, movement, faint echoes, always dismissed as wind or animals, always occurring in places where neither should reasonably reach. Even skeptics admit there is something unsettling about Oradour after dark. The town seems different when the sun goes down. The shadows grow deeper than they should. The air feels heavier. The silence changes, not disappearing, but thickening, as if layered with something beneath it. This is not the kind of place that invites imagination. It resists it. There are no theatrical ruins here, no romantic decay, no ivy reclaiming stone walls in picturesque defiance of time. Everything is stark, exposed, preserved exactly as it was left when life ended abruptly. And that is where the discomfort begins. Because Oradour-sur-Glane was not abandoned gradually. It was not evacuated. It was not rebuilt elsewhere out of necessity. It was left. After the war, France made a decision unlike any other. They chose not to erase this town, not to restore it, not to move on from it. They chose to freeze it in place, a permanent wound in the landscape, a warning without words, a town condemned to remember. Most ruins soften with time. They crumble, fade, disappear into the earth. Oradour was denied that mercy. Every broken wall, every burned frame, every empty room was preserved deliberately, carefully, as if the town itself were evidence in an unending trial. Evidence of what humans can do. Evidence of how quickly normal life can end. Evidence of a day when something crossed a line that should never have been crossed. And yet, even knowing all of this, even understanding the historical reason for its preservation, visitors still ask the same quiet question as they leave. Why does this place feel unfinished? The war ended. The world moved on. Generations passed. But Oradour-sur-Glane never changed. The clocks in the town are gone now, their faces shattered, their hands lost. But if they still hung on the walls, many believed they would all show the same time. The moment everything stopped. This is the story of a town that was never meant to exist beyond one ordinary afternoon. This is the story of what happened when war arrived somewhere it had no reason to be. And this is the story of what may have stayed behind when the killing was over. Before it became a place of silence, Oradour-sur-Glane was a place of routine. Not the kind of routine that feels suffocating, but the gentle repetition that makes life predictable and safe. The kind where mornings arrive the same way each day, where faces are familiar, where nothing feels urgent enough to fear. In the early 1940s, Oradour was a town that woke slowly. Shops opened their shutters one by one, wooden panels creaking as sunlight slipped into narrow streets. The baker's oven was warm before most houses stirred, the smell of fresh bread drifting outward, carried by the river breeze. Children walked to school in small groups, their voices bouncing off stone walls, arguing about nothing important at all. Farmers moved through town with carts and bicycles, nodding to neighbors they had known their entire lives. It was not a rich town. It was not a powerful one. It was not important in any strategic sense. And that was precisely why people believed it was safe. France had already fallen by 1940. German occupation was a reality everywhere, but its intensity varied from place to place. Some towns felt the weight of uniforms and checkpoints daily. Others existed in a strange gray zone, watched but not constantly interfered with, controlled but not crushed. Oradour-sur-Glane belonged to the second category. German soldiers passed through occasionally, but there was no permanent garrison. No major roads ran through the town. No factories, no depots, no rail hubs that would make it useful to the war machine. To the outside world, Oradour barely existed, and the residents preferred it that way. They followed the rules because survival depended on it. Curfews were respected. Paperwork was carried. There were no public acts of defiance, no open resistance, no reason to attract attention. The local mayor, Desorteaux, did what many local officials across occupied France did. He tried to keep the town invisible. Invisibility felt like protection. There were rumors, of course. Stories traveled even when borders closed. People spoke in low voices about arrests in nearby towns, about trains leaving and never coming back, about villages punished for helping the resistance. Everyone knew the war was brutal. Everyone knew the rules could change without warning. But Oradour seemed spared. It had a school. It had shops. It had weddings, funerals, birthdays, and market days. On Saturdays, families gathered in the town center. Children ran between adults, chasing each other around fountains and parked bicycles. Women compared prices and recipes. Men discussed crops, weather, and distant news from radios that crackled more than they spoke clearly. Life continued not because people believed the war would never reach them, but because there was no other way to live. By June 1944, the war felt closer than ever. The Allied landings in Normandy had taken place only days earlier. News spread quickly, even if details were unclear. Some whispered that liberation was coming. Others feared retaliation. Everyone sensed that something had shifted. German units were moving more aggressively. Columns of vehicles passed through rural areas. Soldiers looked more tense, more suspicious. The occupation no longer felt static. Still, Oradour remained quiet. There were two Oradours, though few outsiders realized it. Oradour-sur-Glane, the market town. Oradour-sur-Vers, another village nearby. The similarity of names would later matter, more than anyone could have imagined. On the morning of June 10, 1944, Oradour-sur-Glane woke, as it always had. The sky was clear. The weather was mild. It was a Saturday. Some families were preparing for lunch. Others planned errands. A few children were already thinking about the afternoon, about games, about freedom once school ended. Nothing in the air suggested that this day would be different from any other. Around early afternoon, German vehicles approached the town. This alone was not unusual enough to cause panic. Military convoys passed through many towns without incident. People paused, watched, waited for them to leave. But this time, the soldiers did not pass through. They stopped. Members of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich entered Oradour-sur-Glane and took control of the streets. Armed men spread out quickly, efficiently, with practiced precision. Roadblocks were set. Exits were sealed. Residents were ordered to gather in the town square. The instructions were calm, firm, but not frantic. There was no shouting at first, no violence. People complied. Why wouldn't they? Orders to assemble were common during the occupation. Identity checks, document inspections, searches for resistance members. These things happened elsewhere, and people had learned that obedience often meant survival. Men, women, children, all were told to come. Some were pulled from shops mid-transaction. Others were stopped on the street. Farmers were brought in from the outskirts. Even those hiding briefly were found quickly. The net closed with unsettling speed. Within a short time, nearly the entire population of Oradour stood together in the square. No explanation was given. No accusation was announced. There were rumors, whispered between neighbors. Someone mentioned a kidnapped German officer. Someone else said it had happened near Oradour, but not this Oradour. The names blurred together, fear distorting details. People tried to reassure each other. This is just a check. They'll ask questions and leave. They wouldn't harm women and children. History had taught them to believe these things. Or perhaps they needed to believe them. German officers began separating the crowd. Men were ordered to step forward. Women and children were told to move elsewhere. There was confusion, but no open resistance. Families hesitated, clung to each other briefly, then obeyed. A hand released, a final look, a promise made quietly. I'll see you soon. No one knew those would be their last words. The men were taken to various locations around the town: barns, garages, storage buildings. Ordinary places they had visited countless times before. Places that smelled of hay, oil, dust. Places that felt familiar. The women and children were led to the church. It was the largest building in Oradour. Solid stone walls. A place associated with safety, ritual, and comfort. Mothers calmed crying children. Older girls held younger siblings. Some prayed. Others simply waited. Still, no explanation came. Outside, soldiers positioned themselves carefully. Machine guns were set up. Doors were guarded. And then, without warning, the calm shattered. Gunfire erupted. At first, it sounded distant, muffled by walls and distance. Sharp bursts. Screams cut short. Panic spread instantly. Mothers pressed children closer. Confusion turned to terror. In the barns, where the men had been taken, soldiers opened fire at close range, aiming low. The intent was not immediate death, but incapacitation. Those who fell wounded were left alive, bleeding, helpless. Then the buildings were set on fire. Smoke filled the air. Flames consumed wood, hay, flesh. Some men tried to crawl away. They were shot. Others burned where they lay. In the church, chaos exploded. An incendiary device was placed inside. Smoke spread rapidly, thick and choking. Flames followed. Children screamed. Women pounded on doors. Windows were shattered in desperate attempts to escape. Those who tried were shot. One woman managed to flee through a window, wounded but alive. She would later be the sole adult survivor from the church. She would carry the memory of that moment for the rest of her life. Within hours, Oradour-sur-Glane was no longer a town. It was a grave. But this chapter is not yet about what happened next. It is about the moment before, the moment when life still felt normal, when safety still felt possible, when no one knew they were standing at the edge of something irreversible. Because that is what makes Oradour different. Not just the brutality, not just the numbers, but the absolute absence of warning. War did not creep into this town. It arrived, ended everything, and left behind a place that would never fully return to the world of the living. And somewhere between the routines of that ordinary morning and the silence that followed, Oradour crossed a boundary that history rarely allows anyone to see so clearly. A moment where life was still intact, and the next moment, gone. The killings did not happen all at once. That is one of the details that makes Oradour-sur-Glane so difficult to absorb. Violence did not explode and end in minutes. It unfolded methodically, almost patiently, as if time itself had slowed to watch. After the first gunshots, confusion reigned. Inside the barns and storage buildings where the men were held, the sound of automatic fire echoed off stone and wood. Bullets struck legs, not hearts. Men fell, screaming, collapsing onto dirt floors they had walked across their entire lives. Some tried to stand again. Others crawled instinctively, driven by pain and disbelief more than hope. Then came the fire. Straw was ignited. Fuel was poured. Flames spread quickly, feeding on dry wood and trapped bodies. Smoke filled the enclosed spaces, thick and suffocating, turning air into poison. Those still conscious coughed, choked, clawed at the ground, trying to reach doors that were now blocked. Anyone who managed to stagger outside was shot. There was no chaos among the soldiers, no shouting, no loss of control. This was not a battle. It was an operation. At the church, terror grew more slowly, but no less completely. Women sensed that something was wrong long before the flames appeared. The gunfire from elsewhere in town was impossible to ignore. Some tried to move toward the doors, only to be pushed back by guards. Children began to cry, sensing fear, even when they could not understand it. An incendiary device was placed near the altar. When it ignited, the church filled with smoke almost instantly. It burned eyes and lungs, turning prayer into coughing, screaming desperation. Panic surged. Mothers lifted children, trying to get them above the smoke. Some attempted to break stained glass windows with bare hands, cutting themselves on shattered shards. A few managed to create openings. Those who tried to escape through them were shot. The sound of gunfire mixed with screams and crackling flames, filling the church until nothing else could be heard. Inside, people died from bullets, fire, smoke, and crushing fear. One woman survived. She fell among the dead, wounded, motionless, her body covered by others. When darkness came, when the noise finally faded, she crawled out, broken but alive. Her testimony would later become one of the few direct windows into what happened inside the church. By the time the fires burned down, Oradour-sur-Glane was silent. 642 people were dead. Men, women, children. Entire families erased in a single afternoon. The youngest victim was a few weeks old. The oldest, well into their 80s. There were no survivors among the children. After the killings, the soldiers did not leave immediately. They looted what remained. They searched ruins. They destroyed what the fire had not fully consumed. Then they departed, leaving behind a town that no longer had a future. The bodies were not buried properly. Many were burned beyond recognition. Others lay where they fell. Identification would later be done through fragments, pieces of jewelry, keys, scraps of clothing, anything that could link remains to names. When news of the massacre reached the outside world, it spread slowly at first, filtered through shock and disbelief. Even in wartime, Oradour felt excessive, unnecessary, unexplainable. The official justification offered later pointed to retaliation, to resistance activity, to confusion between Oradour-sur-Glane and Oradour-sur-Ver. Explanations shifted, details blurred. Responsibility dissolved into bureaucracy and post-war silence. But none of it answered the central question. Why this town? There was no confirmed resistance cell in Oradour-sur-Glane. No weapons cache. No ambush launched from its streets. No warning, no ultimatum, no demand. The town was selected and destroyed. For the survivors outside Oradour, the loss was impossible to process. Neighboring villages absorbed the shock, the grief, the horror. People searched for missing relatives, hoping against reason that someone, somewhere, had survived. Most had not. After the war, trials would be held. Some perpetrators would face judgment. Others would never be found. Some would claim they were following orders. Others would deny involvement entirely. Justice, like closure, would remain incomplete. But the story of Oradour did not end with the end of the war. In many ways, that was when it truly began. Because when the fires were extinguished and the dead counted, France faced a choice. What do you do with a town that has been murdered? Most places rebuild. They erase damage. They move forward. Oradour-sur-Glane was not allowed to forget. The decision was made to preserve the ruins exactly as they were found. Streets would remain empty. Buildings would remain broken. Objects would stay where they fell. The town would become a memorial, not in stone statues or plaques alone, but in its entire physical form. A place where absence would speak louder than words. This decision changed Oradour forever. It transformed a site of atrocity into a place of permanent suspension. The town was no longer alive, but it was not allowed to die either. And that, some believe, is when the strange stories truly began. Because Oradour-sur-Glane is not just a ruin. It is a moment held open, a wound that never closed. A place where life ended so suddenly that even now, decades later, it feels as though something is still waiting for permission to move on. The war left many dead cities behind, but few were left exactly as they fell, and fewer still feel like they are still aware of what happened to them. In Oradour, the silence does not feel empty, it feels occupied. When the war finally ended, Europe rushed to rebuild. Cities were cleared. Rubble was hauled away. New foundations were poured over old scars. There was an unspoken agreement across the continent. Destruction would not be allowed to define the future. Life had to move forward, even if memory lagged behind. Oradour-sur-Glane did not follow that pattern. In the months after liberation, officials, survivors, and families of the dead returned to what remained of the town. What they found was not simply damage, but a place that felt suspended in the exact moment of its destruction. Walls were blackened but still standing. Furniture lay where it had fallen. Children's toys rested in streets that no longer echoed with laughter. Nothing had shifted. There was an immediate question, one that had no easy answer. Should Oradour be rebuilt? Some argued that restoring the town would honor the dead by allowing life to continue where it had been stolen. Others believed rebuilding would erase the truth of what had happened. A new town would soften the memory, make the massacre easier to forget, easier to deny. The debate was emotional, bitter, and deeply personal. In the end, the decision was made at the highest level. Oradour-sur-Glane would remain exactly as it was. A new village would be built nearby for the displaced and the survivors. The old town would be sealed, protected, and preserved, not as a ruin reclaimed by nature, but as a frozen crime scene. The decision was unprecedented. France had monuments to war, cemeteries, memorials carved in stone and bronze. But this was different. This was an entire town condemned to remain silent forever, not because it was unimportant, but because it mattered too much to change. The ruins were stabilized, not restored. Walls were reinforced so they would not collapse. Pathways were marked so visitors could walk through without disturbing what remained. Signs were added, explaining what each building had once been. A bakery, a tailor's shop, a school, a garage. Each label made the absence more visible. At first, people came only to mourn. Families walked the streets slowly, pointing out where relatives had lived, where children had gone to school, where lives had once unfolded normally. Flowers were placed near the church. Names were spoken aloud, as if sound might reach where bodies could not. Then, gradually, outsiders began to arrive. Historians, students, journalists, tourists. Oradour became a symbol, a warning, proof of what war could do when ideology replaced humanity. But as the years passed, something unexpected happened. People began to notice that Oradour did not feel like other memorials. Most memorials are quiet, but their silence is gentle, respectful, predictable. Oradour's silence was different. Visitors described it as heavy, almost physical, pressing down on their chests. Some found it difficult to stay long. Others felt drawn in, compelled to walk every street, to stand inside every ruined room, even when they couldn't explain why. Guides began to notice patterns. People who knew nothing of the massacre before arriving often reacted the same way as those who did. They became subdued, distracted, occasionally emotional without knowing why. Children, in particular, seemed affected. Some refused to enter certain areas, especially the church. No one encouraged mystical interpretations. Officially, Oradour was a place of history, not legend. But among those who worked there regularly, quiet conversations began to circulate. Strange things were noticed, usually late in the day. A doorframe that seemed to creak, even though no door remained. Footsteps on gravel when no one else was nearby. A sudden smell of smoke drifting through air that was otherwise clean. Each incident alone was easy to dismiss. Together, they formed a pattern that was harder to ignore. Security guards assigned to patrol the site overnight noticed it most clearly. Oradour at night was not simply darker. It felt altered. Sounds carried oddly. Shadows seemed deeper, more defined. More than one guard admitted to feeling watched, especially near the church and the former school. Cameras were installed to monitor the site, mostly for protection against vandalism. Occasionally, recordings captured unexplained audio, soft noises, faint scraping, indistinct murmurs. Each time, the explanation was the same: wind, animals, old structures settling. And yet, the recordings continued. Some guards requested reassignment after night shifts. Others developed routines, whistling, speaking aloud, keeping radios on even when not required. Silence, many said, was worse than noise. By the 1960s and 70s, Oradour had become an official national memorial. School groups visited regularly, Ceremonies were held. The story was taught, repeated, archived. But even as the facts became fixed, the atmosphere did not soften. Unlike other ruins, Oradour did not decay into abstraction. It did not become picturesque or distant. It remained immediate, raw. Time passed everywhere else. Here, it did not. Some psychologists suggested that the preserved environment created a powerful psychological effect. The brain, they argued, struggled to reconcile the appearance of a living town with the knowledge of mass death. The result was discomfort, heightened awareness, imagined sensations. It was a reasonable explanation, but it did not explain everything. It did not explain why visitors unfamiliar with the story felt the same unease. It did not explain why certain areas felt heavier than others. It did not explain why the church, in particular, seemed to resist calm. There were no official ghost stories attached to Oradour, no named apparitions, no dramatic hauntings, just repetition, the same sensations, the same reports, the same quiet reluctance to dismiss them entirely. Oradour had not become a haunted town in the way people expected. It had become something stranger, a place that did not release what had happened inside it, a place where memory did not fade into history, but lingered in the physical world, embedded in stone, metal, and ash. The decision to preserve Oradour was meant to ensure remembrance, but some began to wonder whether remembrance had come at a cost, whether holding a town in the exact moment of its destruction meant holding everything else there as well. Pain, fear, final thoughts. Whether a place could become saturated with what it had witnessed. Oradour-sur-Glane stood untouched, unchanged, watching generations pass through its empty streets. It did not speak. It did not move. But for those who walked there long enough, it did not feel entirely asleep either. For many years, no one called the stories legends. That word came later. At first, they were simply comments made in passing, usually at the end of a long day, spoken quietly and without expectation of agreement. A guard, mentioning that he thought he heard movement behind him. A guide admitting that certain streets still unsettled her, no matter how many times she walked them. A visitor confessing that they felt relief only after leaving the ruins behind. No one laughed. No one argued. They just nodded, the way people do when they recognize something they cannot fully explain. Oradour-sur-Glane never announced itself as a haunted place. There were no dramatic apparitions, no figures in period clothing walking openly through the streets, no voices calling names in the night. What made the town unsettling was not what appeared, but what seemed to almost appear. The first recurring reports were auditory, footsteps. Visitors described them as slow, measured, unhurried. Not the scattered sound of animals or the random shifting of debris, but the distinct rhythm of someone walking on gravel or stone. Always behind them, always just out of view. People would stop. The sound would stop. They would turn around. Nothing would be there. Many dismissed it immediately. Oradour is an open site. Sound carries strangely between broken walls and narrow streets. Wind can imitate patterns. The mind fills in gaps. But the reports continued. Different people, different years, the same description. Then there were the voices. Not clear words, never sentences. Just the impression of speech, murmurs, distant calls, the rise and fall of human sound without intelligible language. Some described it as hearing people talk through walls, muffled and indistinct. Others compared it to the sound of a crowd heard from far away, even when the site was empty. Most unsettling were the reports from those who did not know the town's history in detail. Several visitors later said they heard children, not crying, not screaming, laughing. Light, brief sounds that vanished almost as soon as they were noticed. When these visitors later learned that no children had survived Oradour, the memory took on a different weight. Smell became another recurring detail. On warm days, when the air should have carried nothing but grass and dust, some reported the sudden scent of smoke. Not the sharp smell of a nearby fire, but something older. Burned wood, ash, charred material. It often appeared near the church ruins and disappeared just as quickly. There were no fires nearby. No explanation that fully satisfied. Security staff began documenting incidents, though never officially as anything unusual. Notes were made, times recorded, patterns observed. Most of the reports occurred late in the afternoon or early evening, when the number of visitors dropped and the town grew quieter. Night intensified everything. Those assigned to patrol after closing hours described Oradour as fundamentally different in the dark. Without people, the ruins no longer felt like a museum. They felt exposed. Streetlights were minimal, placed to guide paths rather than illuminate spaces fully. Shadows filled doorways. Windows became black voids. Sounds seemed louder, closer, even when they were distant. Several guards admitted that they avoided certain areas when possible. The church, the former school, the garages where men had been held. One guard, interviewed years later under condition of anonymity, described a moment that stayed with him. He had been standing near the church, checking locks, when he heard what he thought was a woman coughing. It sounded strained, desperate, the kind of sound made by someone choking on smoke. He moved toward it instinctively, radio in hand, calling out. There was no one there. He told himself it was imagination, fatigue, the wind. But he never lingered near the church again. Cameras installed around the site occasionally recorded anomalies, not visual apparitions but sound. Low-frequency noise, brief spikes of audio activity without visible cause. Each time, technicians reviewed the footage and concluded there was nothing extraordinary. No evidence of intruders, no mechanical malfunction, nothing that could be proven. And yet, the recordings continued. Tour guides developed unspoken habits. Some always ended their tours before dusk. Others avoided telling certain details until after leaving the church ruins, sensing discomfort among groups. A few admitted they felt watched while speaking, as if the town itself were listening, not judging, not threatening, just present. Skeptics offered explanations rooted in psychology. Trauma, they argued, does not vanish simply because decades pass. A preserved environment like Oradour creates a powerful cognitive dissonance. The brain expects life where life once existed. When it finds none, it fills the silence with imagined sensation. Memory seeps into space. It was a compelling theory. But there were problems. People who visited without knowing the full story experienced the same sensations. Some reported unease before learning anything specific about the massacre. Others described discomfort that intensified only in certain locations, without understanding why those places mattered. If it were only suggestion, why was it so consistent? Why did the same spots produce the same reactions? Why did the church, above all else, resist calm? The building itself is not visually dramatic. Its walls are simple. Its interior is empty. There is no decoration to amplify fear. And yet, many visitors reported a sudden heaviness upon entering, a pressure in the chest, a tightening of the throat, an urge to leave. Children reacted most strongly. Teachers supervising school trips noticed it repeatedly. Children who had been calm and curious elsewhere in the ruins sometimes became silent in the church. Some refused to enter. Others asked to leave without explanation. One teacher later recalled a student asking a question that unsettled her deeply. "Why does this place feel crowded?" the child had asked. There was no one else inside. Stories like this circulated quietly, never officially acknowledged, never encouraged, but never entirely dismissed either. Oradour was not marketed as a haunted site. That would have felt wrong, even exploitative. Still, the stories remained. They passed between guards, between guides, between visitors who met by chance and realized they had felt the same thing. No one claimed to see the dead walking the streets. What they claimed was something subtler. That Oradour remembered. That it retained an echo of the moment when life ended violently and without warning. That the suddenness of the massacre left no time for transition, no space for acceptance. The town did not empty itself gently. It was torn open. Some historians suggested that the preservation itself might be responsible. That freezing a place in the exact state of trauma could trap emotional residue, reinforcing memory through physical continuity. Others dismissed this entirely, insisting that stone cannot remember and air cannot hold voices. Perhaps they were right. But Oradour continued to behave differently from other preserved sites. There are many ruins across Europe, many battlefields, many memorials where thousands died. Most feel solemn, few feel unsettled. Oradour does. Even seasoned historians, people who had walked through death camps, trenches, and execution sites, admitted that Oradour affected them differently. Less overt horror, more quiet unease. As if something there refused to become purely historical. As if the town existed in a space between past and present, neither fully alive nor fully gone. There were no ceremonies to cleanse it, no attempts to symbolically release what remained. The mission was remembrance, not resolution. And so Oradour remained, street after street of unanswered questions, building after building of interrupted lives. The longer it stayed unchanged, the stronger the sense became that it was not simply a memorial, but a container. Not for ghosts, for moments. The final thoughts of those who stood in the square, the fear of those separated from their families, the confusion of those who believed, until the very end, that this could not really be happening. Places usually absorb such things and let them fade. Oradour never did. Visitors often leave without speaking. Some look back only once. Others do not look back at all. Almost everyone feels relief when the modern village comes into view, when movement, sound, and normal life return. And that perhaps is the most telling detail of all. Oradour-sur-Glane does not feel like a place that belongs to the world anymore. It feels like a moment the world never finished processing. A silence that learned how to speak. Quietly, persistently, and only to those who stay long enough to listen. There is a moment, just before leaving Oradour-sur-Glane, when most visitors slow down. They do not stop entirely. They simply hesitate, as if something unseen has caught at their clothes, asking, quietly, to be acknowledged one last time. No sign tells them to do this. No guide instructs it. It happens anyway. Beyond the ruins, the modern village waits. Cars pass. Voices carry. Cafes open their doors. Life resumes its familiar rhythm with almost uncomfortable ease. The transition is abrupt enough to feel artificial, like stepping out of a dream that refuses to dissolve completely. People often look back. The old town does not respond. It remains exactly as it has always been. Still, silent, unchanged. And yet many leave with the unsettling feeling that something has followed them to the edge. Not a presence, not a figure, a question. What happens to a place when everything that defined it is destroyed in a single day? Most towns survive war through transformation. Buildings fall, people scatter, memories fragment. Time erodes sharp edges. New lives overwrite old ones. Even the deepest wounds eventually scar over. Oradour-sur-Glane was denied that process. By preserving it exactly as it was left, the town was turned into a vessel, one that holds memory without dilution. Every object remains connected to its final moment of use. A baby carriage that never moved again. A sewing machine that never finished its work. A car that never reached its destination. These are not symbols. They are interruptions. Historians often say that places do not remember. People do. That memory requires minds, stories, repetition. Stone and metal, they argue, are inert. They cannot carry emotion. And yet Oradour challenges that certainty. Because even without knowing the names, the dates, the numbers, visitors feel something there. Something immediate. Something that does not require explanation to register. Perhaps it is not memory in the human sense. Perhaps it is proximity. The distance between past and present in Oradour is unusually thin. There is no reconstruction to soften the transition, no interpretation to buffer the experience. You stand where others stood. You walk the same streets. You occupy the same space, separated only by time. And time, here, feels strangely compressed. Some psychologists suggest that places of sudden mass trauma can create lasting emotional imprints, not supernatural, but neurological. The human brain, they argue, is highly sensitive to environmental cues. When those cues align too perfectly with tragedy, the brain reacts as if the event is still present. Fear lingers, not because it is stored in walls, but because the context remains intact. It is a convincing argument, but it does not fully explain why Oradour feels different, even compared to other preserved sites. Why the unease is quieter, deeper, less performative. Why it does not fade with familiarity. Guides who have walked the ruins for decades still report moments when the town catches them off guard. A sudden chill, a sense of intrusion, an awareness of being somewhere that does not entirely welcome observation. One guide described it this way: most memorials feel like places where something happened. Oradour feels like a place where something is still happening, just not in a way we can see. That statement was never meant to imply the supernatural, but it lingered anyway, because Oradour was not simply destroyed. It was interrupted. There was no evacuation, no gradual loss, no transition from danger to safety. Life ended mid-sentence. That kind of ending does not resolve easily. In many cultures, rituals exist to help the dead move on and the living let go. Funerals, prayers, commemorations, these acts create structure around loss. They give grief a beginning, a middle, and end. Oradour had no such process. The massacre happened. The town burned. The dead remained where they fell. Later, remembrance came. But remembrance is not the same as release. The ruins were preserved as evidence, as warning, as truth made visible. But no ritual was performed to close the moment. No symbolic gesture marked the transition from presence to absence. The town was asked to remember forever. And so it does. Not actively, not intentionally, but persistently. Visitors who experience discomfort, they often struggle to articulate it. It is not fear in the usual sense. There is no immediate danger, no threat, no spectacle. It is closer to the feeling of standing in a room just after an argument has ended. Voices gone, tension still thick in the air. You arrive too late to see what happened, too early to feel at peace. Some leave Oradour convinced that the stories are nothing more than psychological echoes. Others leave uncertain, unsettled by how easily logic failed to fully explain their reactions. A few leave quietly convinced that something remains. Not ghosts, not spirits trapped in the conventional sense, but a residue of final moments, fear, confusion, disbelief, pressed into the physical world by the sheer violence of their ending. Whether that belief is true matters less than the fact that Oradour inspires it. Because places that are fully understood rarely provoke doubt. Oradour refuses to be fully understood. It exists as a reminder, not only of what humans are capable of, but of what happens when destruction outpaces comprehension. When death arrives too quickly for meaning to keep up. The war ended in 1945. Trials were held. Borders shifted. History moved forward. But Oradour-sur-Glane did not follow. It remained behind, holding a single afternoon open for decades. A place where time did not heal, because healing was never the goal. Only remembering. And perhaps that is why the town feels the way it does. Because memory, when left without release, becomes weight. And weight, over time, presses outward, into silence, into sensation, into the subtle feeling that you are standing somewhere you were never meant to stay for long. Oradour does not ask visitors to believe in legends. It asks something simpler: to stand still, to listen, to acknowledge that some events do not end when the noise stops. As you leave, the ruins remain unchanged. The streets stay empty. The windows stay open to nothing. The church stays silent. But the question follows you. If a town is left exactly as it was in the moment it died, what else might be left there with it? And how long can silence hold what it remembers before it finds a way to speak again?